In the summer of 1886, in the wide and unforgiving country of Sweetwater County, in what was then the territory of Wyoming, a man named Soren Festergaard did something that no one who saw it could explain. He planted sunflowers against his cabin, not in a garden plot set apart from the structure, not in a tidy row along a fence line where they might serve as a windbreak for a kitchen patch of beans and squash, but directly against the logs themselves, so close that the seeds were pressed into the dirt within inches of the foundation stones. He planted them on every side, north wall, south wall, the two short ends that faced east and west. 4 unbroken bands of sunflower seeds pushed into the hard Wyoming earth in a tight border that followed the outline of his cabin like a hem stitched too close to the cloth. His nearest neighbor, a cattleman named Ezra Bracken, watched him do it from across the shared fence line one afternoon in late May. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back on his forehead and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing obvious to say. A man planting flowers against a log cabin was not dangerous. It was not offensive. It was simply pointless. And pointlessness in that country, where every hour of summer labor had to justify itself against the killing winters that came down from the mountains every November, was its own kind of failure. Ezra Bracken had ranched the Sweetwater Valley for 19 years. He had watched dozens of families arrive, file their claims, build their cabins, run their cattle, and either survive or break. The ones who survived understood a simple principle that governed everything in that territory. You did not waste summer. Summer was short and winter was long, and every action taken between April and October was either preparation for the cold or it was vanity. He could not determine which category sunflowers fell into, and so he asked. He walked to the fence and called across to Soren and asked plainly and without malice what the sunflowers were for. Soren looked up from the dirt. He was kneeling with his hands black to the wrists, pressing seeds into a shallow trench he had scraped along the base of the north wall. He was 38 years old, lean across the shoulders with the stillness about him that people in the valley had learned to associate not with shyness, but with a kind of settled certainty. He had arrived in Sweetwater County 2 years earlier, a widower with a 7-year-old son and a loaded wagon, and no apparent anxiety about the fact that he was building a life alone in a country that had already taken his wife. He looked at Ezra Bracken across the fence and said, in his quiet way, that they were for the cabin. Ezra waited for more. Nothing more came. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has decided not to press a question whose answer he suspects will not satisfy him, and walked back to his own work. But he carried that small exchange with him into the trading post the next morning, and into his wife Lydia's kitchen that evening, and into the conversations of every man who gathered at the corral on Saturday afternoons to talk about water rights and beef prices and the price of nails. Within 2 weeks, the story had spread through the valley, the way all stories spread in small communities where entertainment was scarce and neighbors were few. Soren Festergaard was growing sunflowers against his cabin, not near it, against it. The telling always emphasized that detail because it was the detail that transformed an odd preference into something genuinely baffling. A man who grew sunflowers in a garden was a man who liked flowers. A man who grew them pressed flat against the walls of his home so close that the stalks would eventually lean against the logs, and the broad leaves would lay flat against the chinking. was a man doing something that needed explaining, and no explanation had been offered. Ezra Bracken, who had asked directly and received no useful answer, became the primary narrator of the story by default. He told it at the trading post, run by Martha Crane, who repeated it to every woman who came in for flour and coffee. He told it to the men at the corral. He told it to his 16-year-old son Wyatt, who told it to every boy at the one-room schoolhouse, where Soren's son Tobin sat in the back row with a book open across his knees. In every telling, Ezra was careful to note that he bore no ill will toward Soren Vestergaard. The man was capable, he kept a clean property, his boy was well-fed and well-mannered. But the sunflowers were a waste of effort, and in Wyoming territory, effort wasted in summer was warmth lost in winter. That was not opinion. That was arithmetic. The name came naturally the way such names always do in tight communities. Someone Ezra thought it might have been one of the Whitaker boys who delivered firewood called it the Flower Cabin. The name stuck because it captured perfectly the absurdity that the community felt. A cabin was not a thing you decorated. A cabin was a tool for surviving winter, and you maintained it the way you maintained any tool with function governing every decision. You chinked the gaps with moss and clay. You banked the foundation with earth in October. You stacked firewood against the north wall to break the wind and feed the stove. These were rational actions taken by rational people against a threat that killed without prejudice. You did not plant flowers. Soren heard the name. He could not have avoided hearing it in a valley that small, where the trading post and the church and the schoolhouse formed the 3 points of a triangle that enclosed every conversation worth having. He heard it, and he continued planting. Beside him on the morning after the seeds were sown sat his son Tobin, 9 years old, holding the canvas seed bag open with both small hands. And beside Tobin, in the long shade of the cabin's east wall, lay the dog. A gray shepherd mix named Bram, 4 years old, with one ear that flopped forward and one ear that stood up straight, and a habit of resting his muzzle on his paws while he watched the family work. Bram had come into their lives the year Mariel died. A drover passing through Marion County, Kansas, had a litter in the back of his wagon that he could not keep. Soren had not been looking for a dog, but the boy Tobin, who had stopped speaking for almost 3 months after his mother's funeral, had walked straight up to the wagon and put his small hand on the head of the gray pup, who was the runt and the only one not yapping for attention. The pup had looked up at the boy with old eyes, and Tobin had said, in the first complete sentence anyone had heard him speak that winter, his name is Bram. Soren had paid the drover $2 and a tin of coffee, and the dog had been with them ever since. Through the move west, through the building of the cabin, through the long, quiet evenings when a father and a son ate supper without speaking because there was nothing to say that could fill the chair where Mariel had once sat. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone so much that their absence sat down at the table with you every night? Have you ever raised a child alone or watched a child raise themselves around the shape of a missing parent? If you have, then you already understand something about Soren Vestergaard that the people of Sweetwater Valley would not understand for a long time. Stay with me, because what this quiet man was doing in the dirt that summer was not eccentric, and it was not foolish. It was love in the only language he had left. Mariel had died in the spring of 1884 in the small cabin they had built together in Marion County, Kansas. She had been delivering their second child, a daughter they had already named Birgitta, after Soren's grandmother, and a fever had taken her 3 days after the birth. The baby had followed her mother before the week was out. Soren had buried them both under a single elm tree on the south corner of their claim, and he had stood at that grave for a long time, and then he had walked back to the cabin and sat down across the table from his son Tobin, who was 7 years old and had just lost his mother and his sister within the same hand of cards that fate had dealt that spring. Soren did not weep at the table. He did not weep in the months that followed. He folded his grief into the work of his hands, because his hands were what he had been given, and because Tobin needed a father who could still wake up in the morning and put bread on the table. But something in him had stopped the way a clock stops when no one remembers to wind it. And in the autumn of that same year, when a circular came through the territory advertising land claims in the Sweetwater Valley of Wyoming, Soren had read it twice, packed his wagon, and left the elm tree behind. He could not bear another spring in that cabin. He could not bear the kitchen door or the bed or the field where Mariel had walked beside him with a basket on her hip. He brought with him his son, his dog, his tools, his wife's wedding band on a leather cord around his neck, and one other thing. A small leather-bound journal, the pages soft from a lifetime of handling, that had belonged to his mother. Astrid Vestergaard, born Astrid Halverson, in Telemark, Norway, in 1848, immigrated with her family at the age of 2 to the Mennonite-bordered farmlands of Marion County, Kansas. Astrid had died when Soren was 19, and she had left him very little except that journal and a body of practical knowledge that she had taught him with her hands the way all durable knowledge is transferred by doing it together, season after season, until the son's hands knew the work before his mind could have explained the reason. It was that knowledge, written down in his mother's small, careful hand on the pages of that journal, that Soren had read again on the long evenings of his first winter in Wyoming. And it was that knowledge that had brought him out into the dirt that May morning with a canvas bag of sunflower seeds and a 9-year-old boy and a gray dog watching from the shade. The flower cabin. That was what they called him now when they spoke of him at all. And Soren, who had been called many things in his 38 years, including widower and immigrant, and the Norwegian, and that quiet man up the creek, added flower cabin to the list and did not argue. There was nothing to argue. The wind would come, and when the wind came, the wind would explain. By the middle of June, the sunflower stalks had broken the soil. Slender green shoots stood in their tight bands around the cabin knee-high by the solstice, and Tobin watered them every evening from a pail he could barely carry, walking slow on his thin legs, while Bram trotted alongside him. The boy had begun to talk more since their arrival in Wyoming. Not much, but more. He asked Soren why the sunflowers leaned toward the morning sun. He asked why the dog circled 3 times before lying down. He asked one evening over a bowl of beans whether his mother had ever planted sunflowers in Kansas. And Soren, who had not spoken Mariel's name out loud in nearly 2 years, looked up from his bowl and said yes, every spring, along the east side of the cabin where you could see them from the window when she was kneading bread. It was the longest thing he had said about her since the funeral. Tobin did not press for more. He understood, in the way that children of grief always understand, that some sentences are doors that must not be forced open all the way at once. Wyatt Bracken, Ezra's son, was 16 years old that summer and full of the casual cruelty that boys of that age sometimes carry like a knife they do not yet know they are using. He saw Tobin at the schoolhouse, which closed for the summer in late May, but reopened briefly in July for a session of arithmetic taught by the new teacher, a young woman named Annette Hartwell. Wyatt and 3 other boys cornered Tobin behind the woodpile on the second day of the session and told him that his father was crazy. They told him that the whole valley was laughing. They told him that his mother had probably died because she was married to a fool, and that his father had brought him out west to die too, and that the flowers around the cabin were going to be the only thing left standing when the bones of the Vestergaards washed out of the creek in spring. Tobin did not cry. He did not fight. He walked home that afternoon with his hands jammed deep in his pockets and his small jaw set in a way that Soren recognized immediately when the boy came through the door. Soren did not ask. He pulled out a chair and put a cup of coffee on the table because there was no other beverage in the cabin, and the boy had reached the age where a father offers him whatever a father has, and he sat down across from his son and waited. After a long silence, Tobin asked, "Why are we planting flowers, Father? They are laughing at us. All of them." Soren did not answer right away. He stood up from the table, walked over to the small shelf beside the bed where he kept his razor and his Bible and his mother's journal, and brought the journal back to the table. He set it down between them. He opened it to a page near the middle, a page that he had read 100 times in the long Wyoming nights, and he turned it so the boy could see. The page was written in pencil in the small, careful hand of Astrid Vestergaard, dated October of 1860. It described a winter storm that had come through Marion County when Astrid was 12 years old, a blizzard that had killed 23 people across 3 counties and frozen cattle standing up in the fields. Astrid had written in the calm, clear sentences of a woman recording something she intended her descendants to remember that her own family had survived in their thinly chinked sod house only because they had nothing better to do during the storm than sit close to the fire and pray. But the family across the section line, a Mennonite family with 7 children and a small girl named Greta Friesen, who was Astrid's only friend in that whole stretch of prairie, had not only survived, they had been comfortable, and in the days after the storm, Astrid had walked through the snow to the Friesen homestead, and she had placed her bare 12-year-old palm against the inside of the sod wall of the Friesen root cellar, and she had felt that the wall was warm, not heated, warm, holding its temperature, giving nothing away, and she had written on that page in pencil that had not faded. In 26 years, the cold could not find the wall. I will never forget that feeling under my palm. Tobin read the page slowly. He was a good reader for 9. His mother had taught him before she died, and Soren had continued the lessons in the long evenings. When Tobin reached the end of the page, he looked up at his father. Did grandmother know how they did it? She did. She watched them do it every autumn for the rest of her childhood. The Mennonite women would carry armloads of dried sunflower stalks to the walls of the root cellar and the animal shelters, and they would pack them against the sod in a thick band 3 and 4 feet deep until the building disappeared behind a mound of dead plant matter. Greta told her that the stalks kept the cold from finding the wall, and grandmother told you. She told me, with her hands, the way she told me everything. Tobin sat for a long time with his hands folded around the cup of cooling coffee. Bram lay under the table with his chin resting on the boy's foot. The cabin was quiet, except for the wind outside, the soft summer wind that carried no warning yet of the killing wind that would come down from the mountains in December. Finally, Tobin asked, "Why don't you tell them, Father? Why don't you tell Ezra Bracken? Why don't you tell the people at the trading post?" Then they would stop laughing. Soren considered the question for a long time. He looked down at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had buried his wife and his daughter and his mother and his own father before the age of 30, and who had learned somewhere along the way that explanations rarely change anything that matters. He said, in his quiet way, "There are things you do because people understand, and there are things you do because you know they are right. I cannot tell you which one matters more. You will have to find that out for yourself. But I can tell you this, Tobin, the winter will come. It always comes. And the winter does not care what people understand. The winter only cares whether the wall is ready." Tobin nodded. He did not say anything else that evening. But understanding does not arrive all at once in a child of 9. It arrives in waves with quiet hours of doubt between them. And on a hot afternoon in late June, after another long day at the schoolhouse, where Wyatt Bracken had drawn a picture of a cabin buried in flowers on the slate behind Tobin's back, the boy came home with red eyes and a tightness around his small mouth that Soren recognized as the look of a child who had been holding something in for too long. Tobin walked past the porch without speaking. He walked to the east row of sunflowers, which were waist-high by then, and he stood very still in front of the youngest stalk. And then in one quick motion he reached down and pulled the small plant out of the ground by its roots. He stood there with the sunflower in his hand. Bram came up beside him and whined. Soren walked off the porch and across the yard and knelt down in the dirt beside his son. He did not raise his voice. He did not take the plant from the boy's hand. He simply picked up the small trowel from where Tobin had dropped it that morning, scooped a fresh hole in the loose soil, and waited. Tobin, after a long moment in which neither of them spoke, knelt down beside his father and placed the small uprooted stalk back into the hole with both of his small hands. They pressed the dirt back around it together. The plant would survive. Most of them do if you are gentle enough with them when you put them back. Soren did not lecture his son. He stood up. He brushed the dirt from his knees, and before he walked back to the porch, he placed his hand very briefly on the top of Tobin's head. That was all. That was the whole conversation. But the boy did not pull up another sunflower for the rest of his life. At the end of June, an old man named Mordecai Hollis came up the wagon track to the cabin. Mordecai was 71 years old that summer. He had trapped beaver in the Wind River Mountains in the 1840s, fought briefly with the Union Army in 1863 before a leg wound sent him home, and lived alone in a dugout on the far edge of the Sweetwater Valley for the last 26 years. He was thin and stooped and had a beard that hung halfway down his chest, and he was the only man in the valley whom Ezra Bracken called Sir when they met on the road. Mordecai stopped at the fence line and looked at the sunflower beds growing tall around the cabin. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he walked through the gate and came up to the porch where Soren was splitting kindling for the stove. "You from Norway?" Mordecai asked. "My mother was. I was born in Kansas. Saw the Lakota do something like this once up near the Powder River before everything went bad up there. They would pack tall grass and buffalo hide against the lodge walls before the worst winters. Old men in the camp would point at the sky and say a word I did not understand, and the next day the whole camp would be packing grass. They knew the wind. They knew what it does to a wall. Soren set down his axe. He had not heard another human being in Sweetwater County refer to the principle behind his work, and the words of the old trapper landed in him the way a familiar voice lands in a man who has been alone in a strange country for a long time. He invited Mordecai inside for coffee. The two of them sat at the small table and drank from tin cups and did not say very much. Bram lay between their boots. Tobin, who had been reading on the bed, came over and sat on the floor beside the dog and listened with the patient attention of a child who has learned that the most important things adults say are usually said quietly. When Mordecai stood up to leave, he placed a hand on Soren's shoulder. He said, "Winter is going to be bad this year. I can read the sky. The geese are already restless. The muskrats up at the creek are building lodges twice as thick as last year. You keep planting, son. You keep planting." And then he walked back down the wagon track slow on his bad leg and disappeared into the long shadow of the cottonwoods along the creek. Soren stood on the porch for a long time after the old man was gone. Tobin came up beside him and slipped his small hand into his father's. Bram leaned against their legs. The sun was going down over the western ridges, and the sunflower stalks were already knee-high and climbing, and somewhere across the valley a hawk was calling. And Soren thought for the first time since he had buried Marielle under the elm tree in Kansas that he had not made a mistake by coming to Wyoming. Now, let me pause here just for a moment and ask you something, because I think there are some of you watching tonight who know exactly what Soren felt on that porch. You have made a decision in your life that the people around you did not understand. Maybe you moved to a place no one thought you should move to. Maybe you walked away from a marriage or stayed in one. Maybe you started something at 60 that everyone said you should have started at 30 or not at all. And you have been carrying that decision through quiet evenings with no one to validate it, and the only thing you have to go on is a feeling under your own hand that tells you the wall is right. Tell me in the comments if you feel moved to. What is the thing you are quietly building that the people around you cannot see? I read them. I read every one, and I want you to know that the rest of this story is for you. Because Soren Vestergaard was about to be tested in a way that no man should be tested, and the wall he had built was about to answer for everything. July came in with a heat that pressed down on the valley like a hand on a chest. The sunflowers stood thigh-high. By the middle of the month, they had passed Soren's waist. By the first week of August, they had passed his shoulders. And by the time the harvest moon rose at the end of August, the cabin was surrounded on all four sides by a wall of green and gold that stood 10 feet tall and rustled in the wind like a crowd of patient watchers, each one with a great heavy head, turning slowly through the day to follow the sun. The effect when seen from the wagon road was something that stopped people in their tracks. The cabin had disappeared. In its place stood a small square fortress of living gold, its walls swaying gently. Its faces all turned the same direction at the same time, so that a traveler approaching from the east in the morning saw a wall of sunflower faces gazing back at him, and a traveler approaching from the west in the late afternoon saw the same. Children passing by on the way to the creek would stop and stare. Wyatt Bracken, who rode that way once a week to fetch a sack of feed from the trading post, made a habit of slowing his horse and shaking his head in elaborate disbelief, performing his scorn for whoever happened to be watching. But there were others, too, who saw what was happening at the Vestergaard cabin and did not laugh. There was Klaus Vogt, the German immigrant who ran a small dairy 2 miles down the creek. Klaus had come to Wyoming in 1879 from a village in Westphalia with his wife Margaret and his twin daughters Friederike and Liesel, and one afternoon in early August he was driving his milk wagon back from town when he saw Soren on a ladder tying up a sunflower stalk that had begun to lean. Klaus stopped the wagon. He climbed down. He walked slowly up to the fence and stood there for several minutes just looking with the same expression that Mordecai Hollis had worn 6 weeks earlier. Then he said in his thick Westphalian accent, "My grandmother. She did this. In the old country, the wind cannot find the wood." Soren climbed down from the ladder. He walked over to the fence. The two men looked at each other across the wire. Two immigrants in a foreign country, both of them carrying knowledge that their grandmothers had taught them with their hands, both of them, in a place that called that knowledge eccentric. Klaus reached over the fence. Soren shook his hand. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Klaus said, "I will plant some myself next year. This year, I am too late, but I will plant. And when the winter comes, you and I will know." Soren nodded. Klaus climbed back into the wagon and drove on. And as the dust settled behind the wagon wheels, Soren stood at the fence for a long time, watching the road and thinking that he was not alone, that in a country full of laughter there were always one or two who knew, and sometimes that was enough. That same week, the new school teacher, Annette Hartwell, walked past the cabin on her way to deliver a basket of preserves to old Mordecai Hollis, who lived in his dugout on the far edge of the valley. She was 26 years old, slender, with light brown hair that she kept in a tight braid down her back, and she had taken the teaching position in Sweetwater Valley after her father, a Methodist minister in Iowa, had died of a stroke the previous winter. She had nothing left in Iowa, and the Territorial School Board had offered $11 a month and a small room behind the schoolhouse, and she had come west with the kind of cautious hope that women of her generation carried into new country. She stopped at the Vestergaard fence. She watched the sunflowers move slowly in the August breeze. She watched Tobin walking between the rows with a small pair of clippers, snipping dead leaves from the lower stalks with great seriousness. She watched Bram following the boy step for step, occasionally lying down in the shade to wait. Annette had heard the stories about the flower cabin. She had heard them from Martha Crane at the trading post, who told them with a sideways shake of her head. She had heard them from Wyatt Bracken, who told them with open mockery. But standing at the fence that afternoon, she did not see a man who had lost his mind. She saw a father and a son and a dog working together in the late afternoon light with the careful, unhurried pace of people who knew exactly what they were doing. She walked on without speaking, but that evening, when she returned the empty basket to Martha Crane's trading post, and Martha asked her with a smirk whether she had seen the flower cabin, Annette set the basket down on the counter and said in her clear school teacher's voice, "I saw a man working with his son. I think people in this valley should mind their own business." Martha Crane raised both her eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared into her hair, but she did not say anything else, and Annette walked back to her small room behind the schoolhouse and did not sleep well that night, because she had never spoken so sharply to a grown woman in her life, and because something about the silent man and the silent boy and the dog had moved her in a way she could not yet name. The first signs came at the end of August. Mordecai Hollis came down out of the high country with a story to tell. The muskrat lodges along Sweetwater Creek were twice as thick as the previous year, twice as tall, twice as carefully woven. The geese had begun moving south 2 weeks earlier than usual in tight V formations that crossed the sky from horizon to horizon. The cattle on the high pasture were standing with their rumps to the northwest and would not be turned no matter how the herders shouted. The horses at the livery in town were eating more than they should be packing on weight that they would need before spring. And the coats of the deer that Mordecai had been watching from his dugout were already winter-thick in late August, 6 weeks earlier than any year he could remember. Mordecai walked the valley for 3 days in early September, stopping at every cabin and ranch house and saying the same thing in the same calm voice. Winter of '86 is going to be a killing winter. Get your wood split, get your roofs patched, get your stock close to home. This one is coming hard. Ezra Bracken laughed when Mordecai said it at the corral on a Saturday morning. You say that every year, old man. But that night, Ezra walked out behind his barn and looked up at the sky for a long time, and he did not laugh any more. He went inside and told Lydia to start drying more meat than she had planned to dry. He told his foreman to bring the cattle down from the high pasture earlier than usual. He did not tell anyone that he was afraid. Men of Ezra Bracken's generation did not say such things out loud, but he was afraid. Dr. Felix Reinhardt, the town physician, who had come to Sweetwater from Bavaria by way of medical school in St. Louis, was perhaps the most quietly worried man in the valley. He had been watching the barometer in his office for 3 weeks, and the readings were doing things he had never seen them do in 22 years of medical practice in cold country. Pressure was dropping in long, slow waves, climbing back up part way, then dropping again. The atmosphere was unsettled in a way that did not match any pattern he had been taught to read. He said nothing publicly. He was not a man who liked to look foolish. But in the evenings he sat alone in his office with a cup of brandy and watched the needle of the barometer and thought about his patients and about the women in their last months of pregnancy and about old Mrs. Henning, who had been in poor health since spring. And at the Vestergaard cabin, the sunflowers had reached their full height, and their full height stopped men on the road. The stalks grew 9 and 10 feet tall, thick as broom handles, at the base leaning gently against the logs with the slow, heavy pressure of living things seeking support. The heads were enormous, 12 and 14 inches across, and they turned through the day to follow the sun, so that the cabin appeared to be surrounded by a crowd of tall, attentive figures, all of them facing the same direction at the same moment. In the morning, the east wall vanished behind a wall of gold. By afternoon, the gold had moved to the west wall, and the east wall reappeared as a forest of broad green leaves and patient bowed heads. The effect was beautiful in a way that Soren had not planned and did not care about, and it deepened the community's conviction that what he was doing was decorative, that a thing this beautiful could not possibly be functional. That was the error, and it was an error rooted so deeply in the assumption that survival and beauty occupied separate categories that no one in the valley thought to question it. Ezra Bracken walked past the cabin in late August and stood for a moment looking at the sunflowers which now formed a solid wall of green and gold rising above the roofline on three sides. He shook his head slowly. He said to Lydia that evening, over a supper of beef and biscuits, that it was a shame because Soren was otherwise a sensible man, and those sunflowers were drawing moisture against the logs, and moisture against logs meant rot, and rot meant a cabin that would not stand 5 winters. He said it with the confidence of a man who had built 3 cabins in his life and understood wood the way a surgeon understands tissue. He was not being cruel. He was being precise. And he was wrong. He was so deeply, so completely wrong that the wrongness would visit his family in ways he could not yet imagine, and he would carry the memory of his own wrongness with him to the grave. But Soren did not know this yet, and neither did Ezra. They both went to bed that August night under the same sky, and they both rose the next morning to their separate work, and neither of them knew that across the mountains to the north in the high country, where the wind comes from something enormous, was already building, something that would change the valley forever, something that would test every cabin and every wall and every belief about what survival meant. And only one wall in Sweetwater County was being built to answer it. Stay with me, because the test is coming. And what the wall does when the wind finally arrives is going to break some hearts and mend others. And it is going to ask each of you watching tonight the same question it asked the people of Sweetwater Valley. Are you ready? Are the people you love ready? Have you been laughing at someone you should have been listening to? The answer matters. Because winter always comes. The winter always comes. September arrived in Sweetwater Valley, the way it always arrived in that country, with a sharpness in the morning air that came overnight as if someone had opened a door in the mountains and let something through that had been waiting all summer. The cottonwoods along the creek went yellow in a single week. The grass on the hills turned the color of old rope, and Soren Vestergaard's sunflowers began to die. They died standing, which is the way sunflowers always die. The stalks drying from the base upward, the green fading to pale brown, the great heads dropping forward under the weight of their own seeds until they hung like bowed heads in a church at evening prayer. Soren harvested some of the seeds for the next spring's planting, working through the rows with Tobin in the soft September afternoons, twisting the dried heads from the stalks and shaking the black and gray striped seeds into burlap sacks. But most of the heads he left in place, and most of the stalks he left standing, because the standing dead sunflowers were not the harvest. They were the wall. Beginning on the first Monday of September, Soren and Tobin began the second phase of the work. They went out each morning with lengths of jute cord and a small ladder, and they began to tie the standing dried stalks together in bundles, pulling them tight against the logs of the cabin so that no gap remained between the dried vegetation and the wall. Where stalks had fallen during the August storms or broken under their own weight, they gathered them from the dirt and wove them back into the standing rows, filling every space. Soren took the dried sunflower heads, broad, fibrous discs the size of dinner plates, and pressed them into the gaps between stalks like a mason pressing stones into mortar. The work was slow. The work was meticulous. The work took them 17 days. They began at the north wall because the north wall took the worst of the winter wind that would come from the mountains. They moved around the cabin in a clockwise direction, working from foundation to eave on each wall, before moving to the next, packing the dried sunflower material into a dense layer 3 feet thick that gripped the logs like an enormous fibrous blanket frozen in time. Bram lay in the shade of the work and watched, occasionally getting up to retrieve a fallen length of cord and carry it solemnly to Tobin's hand. Tobin, who had turned 10 in the second week of September, worked beside his father with the steady patience of a boy who had finally understood in the deep, wordless way of childhood understanding that he was doing something important. By the end of the third week of September, the cabin had vanished. A person passing on the wagon road would no longer see a log structure, would no longer see even the outline of one. They would see a mound of dried brown plant matter, roughly rectangular, with a black stovepipe emerging from the top and a narrow gap left clear where the door was. It looked to anyone who did not know what they were looking at like neglect, like a structure being slowly consumed by the land around it, like a cabin that had been abandoned years ago and was returning slowly and patiently to the dirt that had made it. Ezra Bracken saw the finished work from the road one morning in early October and said loud enough for his son Wyatt to hear that the flower cabin had become the dead flower cabin and that Soren would be pulling mice out of his walls by Christmas. Wyatt laughed in the way that boys laugh when they want their father's approval more than they want to be kind. And the joke moved through the trading post the next day, and the name Dead Flower Cabin entered the vocabulary of Sweetwater Valley, and it stayed there through the first week of October and through the second and through the third, while behind the dense packed wall of dried vegetation, Soren Vestergaard quietly finished his preparations for a winter he could feel coming under the soles of his boots. Reverend Obadiah Pemberton came to call on the Vestergaard cabin in the third week of October. He had been pastor of the small Methodist congregation in Sweetwater for 9 years, and he was a careful, deliberate man of 58, with white side whiskers and a way of holding his hat in both hands when he spoke that conveyed both humility and an unspoken authority. He had been hearing the talk about Soren for months. He had been particularly hearing the talk that suggested the man was unwell, that the loss of his wife 2 years earlier had unsettled his mind in ways that were only now becoming visible. The Reverend had come to the cabin, he believed, out of pastoral concern. He was not prepared for what he saw. He stopped his buggy at the gate and stared at the great brown mound where the cabin had been. He saw the boy Tobin emerge from the narrow doorway with a bucket and walk toward the well, and he saw the gray dog trotting at the boy's heel, and he saw the father Soren standing on the porch in his shirt sleeves, splitting a final cord of kindling for the stove. The Reverend climbed down from his buggy and walked through the gate holding his hat in both hands, and he began to speak in the careful voice he used with the bereaved. He said that he had been thinking of Soren often these past months. He said that the loss of a wife was a wound that some men carried very well on the outside, while bearing it heavily on the inside. He said that there were resources available, that the church was always open, that a man in difficulty did not have to face his difficulties alone. And then, with all the gentleness he could summon, he said that perhaps Tobin might benefit from spending some time, just for a while, with a family in town who could look after him. There was the Hartwell girl, the new school teacher. She had a spare room. She had offered, just for a few weeks perhaps, until Soren was feeling more himself. Soren had not moved during the Reverend's speech. He had stood on the porch with the axe in his hand and listened without interruption. When the Reverend finished, there was a long silence. The wind moved through the dead sunflower stalks, and they made a dry, rustling sound that was the only sound in the world for a moment. Then Soren set the axe down against the porch rail. He walked to the edge of the porch. He looked at the Reverend, who was still holding his hat in both hands, and he spoke in a voice so quiet that the Reverend had to lean forward to hear him. "Reverend Pemberton, my wife has been dead for 2 years and 4 months. I have not lost my mind. I have buried a wife and a daughter and a mother and a father, and I have raised my son alone in 2 territories, and I am building a home that will keep him alive through whatever winter is coming. You are a good man. I know you mean well, but you will leave my son with me, and you will leave my land now, and the next time you doubt me, you will come and stand inside this cabin in January before you say a word against me again." The Reverend opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the great mound of dried sunflower stalks. He looked at the boy Tobin, who had stopped at the well and was watching the porch with the wide, quiet eyes of a child who has heard his father defend him for the first time in his life. He looked at the dog, and he turned slowly, and he walked back to his buggy without putting his hat on his head, and he drove back toward town with the reins loose in his hands, and he did not speak about the Vestergaards from the pulpit that Sunday or any Sunday after, and he was for the rest of his life a slightly different man than he had been on the morning he drove up the wagon track to the flower cabin. That same week, a young rancher named Jubal Whitaker, 28 years old with a thin mustache and a habit of laughing too loud, walked into Martha Crane's trading post and announced that he was opening a betting pool. $5 a head. The wager was simple. Would the flower cabin still be standing on the first day of spring, or would it be a heap of frozen mouse-eaten vegetable matter under the snow? Jubal himself bet $5 that it would fail. Wyatt Bracken, who had ridden in with his father for supplies, dug into his pocket and bet $2 on the same side. Martha Crane held the money in a tin behind the counter and recorded the names in a ledger with the satisfaction of a woman who knew that whichever way the bet went, she would have a story to tell for years. And then Klaus Vogt walked into the trading post for a sack of coffee. He listened to Jubal's joke. He set the coffee down on the counter, looked Jubal in the eye, and said in his thick German accent, "I will bet $10. The cabin will stand. The cabin will stand because the man who built it knows something that you do not know." Klaus put $10 on the counter. Martha Crane recorded the bet in the ledger. Jubal Whitaker laughed, but the laugh was a little thinner than it had been a moment before. And then, to the surprise of everyone in the trading post that afternoon, the school teacher Annette Hartwell, who had come in for a pound of flour, set $3 on the counter and said, "Mark me for the cabin as well." Martha Crane raised her eyebrows. Wyatt Bracken laughed and asked what Annette knew about building a cabin. And Annette, who did not know anything about building a cabin, but who had been watching Tobin Vestergaard sit in the back row of her schoolroom for 2 months, and had seen him read 3 books that were beyond his age, and had seen him answer arithmetic questions that the older boys could not answer, said, "I know that a boy who is being raised by a fool does not grow into the kind of boy that Tobin Vestergaard is. So mark me down for the cabin." The trading post was quiet for a moment after she said it. Then Klaus Vogt smiled the only time anyone in Sweetwater had ever seen Klaus Vogt smile, and he picked up his coffee and tipped his hat to Annette and walked out into the October sunshine. October passed, November arrived, and with November came the first of the real warnings. The October snows had come 3 weeks early. The ground had frozen in the first week of November, which was 2 weeks ahead of any year Mordecai Hollis could remember. The creek ice was 4 inches thick before Thanksgiving. Every sign pointed in the same direction, and every sign said the same thing: prepare or suffer. The valley responded the way frontier communities always responded to the threat of extreme cold. Firewood was split and stacked. Cabins were rechinked with fresh moss and clay. Draft animals were brought close and sheltered. Root cellars were checked and counted again. Ezra Bracken spent the first 2 weeks of November splitting pine and stacking it against the north wall of his cabin in cords that rose above the windowsill, because stacked firewood against a wall served double-duty fuel reserve and windbreak. It was the standard practice. It was effective. Ezra had survived 19 winters on the Sweetwater using exactly this method. He had no reason to question it. Soren Vestergaard split firewood too, but he stacked it inside the cabin along the interior walls because the exterior walls were already occupied. The sunflower stalks stood where he and Tobin had bound them in September, dried now to the color and hardness of old bone, frozen into a rigid mass by the early November cold. Snow had settled into the outer layer of stalks and frozen there, adding another barrier. The structure that Ezra Bracken had called the Dead Flower Cabin was quietly becoming something else. A cabin wrapped in a cocoon of dead air and fibrous insulation and frozen moisture that functioned exactly the way a second wall would have functioned, except that it had cost nothing to build, required no nails, no lumber, no labor beyond what one man and one boy could do with their hands, and a length of cord through the slow summer afternoons. On the night of November the 11th, Soren stood outside the cabin and looked up at the sky. There was a stillness in the air that he had felt only once before on a January night in Kansas, in the year he turned 20, the night before a blizzard had killed 11 people in Marion County. He knew that stillness. His mother had taught him to know it. Bram stood at his side and whined soft and low the way a dog whines when it senses something it cannot name. Tobin came out onto the porch in his nightshirt and stood beside his father, and Soren put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and together they looked up at a sky full of stars so sharp they seemed to be cut from ice. Soren said very quietly, "It is coming, Tobin. It is coming soon. And before I take you into what came next, I want you to stop with me for a moment. I want you to think about the people in your own life, the neighbors, the grown children, the grandchildren, the friends. Have you said the things to them that you would want them to remember if a hard winter came tomorrow? Have you forgiven the small grievances, the silly arguments, the misunderstandings that have kept you apart? Because what happened next in Sweetwater Valley happened fast. And some of the people who had laughed at Soren Vestergaard in the trading post would not live to see another spring. And some of them would live and would carry their wrongness with them for the rest of their days. Either way, no one in the valley would ever forget the winter of 1886. And no one watching this tonight, I hope, will forget the question I am about to ask you. When the wind comes for the people you love, will the wall be ready? Tell me. I want to know. The storm arrived on the 12th of January, 1887, 6 weeks, into a winter that had already broken the records of every old man in Sweetwater County. It came down out of the northwest, which was the direction storms always came from in that part of Wyoming, but it came with a speed and a violence that even Mordecai Hollis had not predicted. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees above zero to 42 degrees below zero in the space of 6 hours. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west at 15 miles an hour through the morning, swung hard to the north and then doubled again, until it was a sustained roar of 70 miles an hour with gusts that Mordecai later estimated at 85. The snow was not falling snow. It was driven snow horizontal so thick that a person standing in it could not see their own outstretched hand. It was the kind of storm that did not simply challenge shelter, but tested the fundamental question of whether a given structure was shelter at all, or merely an arrangement of materials waiting to be proved insufficient. The cattle of the Sweetwater Valley began to die in the first hour. They died standing in the high pastures where they had not been brought down in time. They died in the lower pastures where the wind drove them against the fences and held them there until the cold took them. They died in the open feed lots where there was no shelter and no windbreak that could break a wind like this one. Across Sweetwater County, across the whole of Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas, the great storm of January 1887 was already beginning the work that history would remember as the Great Die-Up, the storm that broke the open-range cattle industry forever, the storm that killed millions of animals and dozens of men and reshaped the West more thoroughly than any single event of the 19th century. But the people of Sweetwater Valley did not know they were inside history that night. They only knew that the wind had found their walls. In the bracken cabin, the wind found the chinking first. Ezra had rechinked the north wall in October the way he did every year, with fresh moss and clay packed tight into the gaps between the logs. But the clay had dried during the unusually cold November, and small fissures had opened in the joints, where the temperature had cycled through too many freezes and thaws. The wind found every one of those fissures. It came through them like water, through a leaking dam, not in great gusts, but in steady, relentless streams that pulled the heat out of the cabin faster than the cast-iron stove could replace it. Within 4 hours of the storm's arrival, frost was forming on the inside of the north wall. By the 6th hour, the temperature in the cabin, which Ezra was maintaining with a stove burning at full capacity, had dropped to 38 degrees. By the 10th hour, it was at 32. By the 12th hour, ice was forming in the water bucket on the kitchen table. Lydia Bracken wrapped her 3 children in every blanket they owned and put them in the bed closest to the stove and told them not to move. Movement burned warmth, and warmth was a finite resource that was being consumed faster than it could be made. Her youngest, a 7-year-old girl named Emma, did not cry. She did not speak. She lay between her 2 older brothers under the pile of blankets and stared up at the ceiling beams with the wide, quiet eyes of a child who is too cold to make sound. And Lydia, watching her daughter not cry, felt a fear that she had never felt before in her life, a fear that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the small, still face on the pillow. Ezra burned the firewood he had stacked inside the cabin in 2 days. The cords he had stacked outside against the north wall, which were supposed to be his main reserve, were buried under 4 feet of driven snow and inaccessible through a door that could not be opened against the force of the wind. He estimated, with the cold arithmetic of a man who had counted cords every winter of his adult life, that his interior supply would last another 30 hours. After that, the stove would go out. After that, the cold would have nothing to push back against. After that, his children would die. 300 yards to the east, inside the structure that the valley had been calling the Dead Flower Cabin since October, Soren Vestergaard sat in a rocking chair near his stove and listened to the storm. He could hear it. The sound was immense, a roar that seemed to come from the sky itself, as if the atmosphere had developed a voice and was using it to scream. But the sound was muffled. It reached him through the log walls, the way sound reaches a person underwater, present but dampened, stripped of its sharpness, robbed of the quality that makes a storm feel like it is happening to you rather than near you. The reason was outside, pressed against every wall in a band 3 feet thick. The sunflower stalks were taking the wind. They were taking it the way a breakwater takes a wave, not by resisting it with mass, but by disrupting it with structure. The wind hit the outer layer of dried stalks and broke, not stopped, broken. Its coherent force was shattered into 1,000 small turbulences that turned and collided and canceled each other among the dense tangle of hollow stems and fibrous heads and frozen leaves. By the time what remained of the wind reached the log wall beneath it was no longer wind in any meaningful sense. It was still air, and still air pressed against a log wall does not strip heat. It holds it. Inside the cabin, the stove burned at the same modest rate that Soren maintained on any winter evening. The temperature on the interior wall, the wall that Soren could touch from his rocking chair, was cool, but not cold. No frost formed, no condensation gathered. The logs were dry to the touch because the moisture that the January air carried, moisture that was freezing against every exposed log wall in the valley, expanding in the grain, cracking, chinking, opening the gaps that the wind would then exploit, that moisture had been absorbed by the dried sunflower material before it ever reached the wood. The stalks were a sponge and a shield simultaneously. They drank what was wet and broke what was fast, and behind them the cabin sat in a pocket of still dry air that the storm could not reach. Tobin sat on the floor near the stove reading a book. He was 10 years old. He was not wrapped in blankets. He was wearing a wool shirt and stockings, and his feet were bare where he had tucked them beneath him. And the fact of those bare feet in a cabin during a 70-mile-an-hour blizzard in January in Wyoming territory was a detail so quietly impossible that it would have stopped Ezra Bracken's breath if he had seen it. Bram lay between Tobin and the stove with his chin on his paws. The dog's eyes were half closed. He was warm. The boy was warm. The father was warm. And outside in the dark, the wind was taking the world apart. The first night passed. The second day came, though no sun rose that any person in Sweetwater Valley could see. The storm did not slacken. It deepened. By the second night, the temperature outside had fallen to 50 below zero. Wind chill, a calculation that no one in 1887 had yet been taught to make, would have placed the effective temperature at 85 degrees below zero. the temperature at which exposed human flesh freezes in less than 2 minutes. It was during the second night that the knock came. Soren was reading aloud to Tobin from a copy of Treasure Island when he heard it. A small, weak sound at the cabin door, so weak that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Bram lifted his head from his paws. The dog's ears went forward. The dog stood up, walked slowly to the door, and stood there with his nose against the bottom of the doorframe. He did not growl. He whined soft and low the way he had whined on the porch on the night of November the 11th. Soren got up. He went to the door. He took down the heavy wool coat that hung on the peg beside it. He braced his shoulder against the door, lifted the latch, and pulled. The wind tore the door open and almost took it off its hinges. A blast of snow and air came into the cabin, and Soren had to lean against it to hold the door from slamming against the inside wall. But there, on the porch, half fallen against the wall of dried sunflower stalks beside the door, was a small dark shape that was not snow. It was a person. It was a boy. It was Wyatt Bracken. Soren reached out with both arms and pulled the boy into the cabin. He shoved the door closed against the wind and dropped the bar. He turned. Wyatt Bracken lay on the cabin floor in the small puddle of melting snow that was already forming around him. His coat was frozen stiff. His face was white in patches and gray in patches. His lips were blue. The fingers of his right hand, which he had been carrying inside his coat, were the color of old wax, and when Soren peeled the glove away from them, 2 of them did not bend. Frostbite. Deep frostbite. The kind that would cost the boy parts of 2 fingers before the doctor was done with him and would leave him without feeling in those hands for the rest of his life. But he was alive. Tobin was already moving. He had pulled a blanket from the bed. He brought it to his father. Soren wrapped the boy in it and laid him on the rug in front of the stove. Bram, without being told, lay down beside Wyatt and pressed the length of his warm body against the boy's side. Tobin went to the stove and ladled hot broth from the pot that simmered there into a tin cup, and brought the cup to the boy's lips and held it while Wyatt drank slow and shaking his teeth, clattering against the tin so hard that some of the broth ran down his chin. Wyatt Bracken, 16 years old, who had cornered Tobin Vestergaard behind the woodpile in July and told him his father was a fool, lay on the floor of the flower cabin and wept. He wept while the small boy he had mocked held a tin cup to his lips. He wept while the gray dog he had laughed at warmed his ribs. He wept while the man he had called a fool knelt beside him and gently worked the frozen coat off his shoulders. And Wyatt Bracken, in the middle of his weeping, gasped out the words that had brought him stumbling through 80-mile-an-hour winds across 300 yards of open ground in the middle of the night. His father had sent him. The Bracken cabin was almost out of firewood. His sister Emma had not opened her eyes in 6 hours. His father had sent him to find Mordecai Hollis because Mordecai had a deep dugout and stockpiled wood. But Wyatt had gotten turned around in the storm. He had been walking for he did not know how long. And then he had seen through the driven snow the faintest yellow glow of a stovepipe leaking warm air into the night above the Vestergaard cabin. And he had walked toward it because the dead flower cabin was the only thing he could see. Soren listened. He did not interrupt. When Wyatt finished, Soren stood up. He looked at Tobin. He looked at Bram. He looked at the boy on the floor. "Stay with him," Soren said to Tobin. "Keep the broth coming. Keep the blanket tight. I am going to your neighbor's. Father, you cannot. I have to, son. Emma is your age. I have to. He pulled on his heavy wool coat. He pulled on the fur cap that had belonged to his father. He pulled on 2 pairs of woolen mittens. He took a coil of rope from the peg by the door, the long jute rope that he had used in September to tie up the sunflower stalks, and he tied one end of it to the porch post and looped the other end around his own waist. He looked once at his son. He looked once at the dog. He opened the door against the screaming wind and stepped out into a world that was trying to kill everything it could reach. The walk to the Bracken cabin should have taken 4 minutes. It took Soren Vestergaard 41 minutes. He could not see. He could not breathe properly. He fell 3 times in the deep snow that had drifted across the wagon track. The rope around his waist played out behind him until it reached its full length and pulled taut against the porch post he had tied it to, and then he stood at the end of the rope in the dark and the wind, and he could not tell which direction the Bracken cabin lay in. He turned slowly, with his eyes shut against the driven snow, and he listened. And after a long moment, he heard very faintly through the roar of the wind the high, thin sound of a child crying. It was the first sound Emma Bracken had made in 6 hours, and it gave Soren Vestergaard the direction he needed. He found the Bracken cabin by following the sound of the crying. He pounded on the door with both fists. Ezra Bracken, who had been sitting in front of his nearly empty wood box with his head in his hands, did not at first understand what he was hearing. When he opened the door and saw Soren on his porch, frosted to the eyebrows with a rope around his waist, trailing into the storm, he could not speak. Soren said, "Get the children, get Lydia, get yourselves. Tie this rope around the youngest. We are going to my cabin." Ezra Bracken, the man who had called Soren a fool, who had narrated the story of the flower cabin to every man in the valley, who had stood at his own fence and shaken his head at his neighbor's wasted summer, looked at Soren Vestergaard in the storm-screaming dark of his porch, and he did the only thing left for a man to do. He obeyed. It took them almost 2 hours to make the return journey. Soren went first, following the rope back to its anchor on his own porch post, with little Emma Bracken bundled inside his coat against his chest, her small frozen hands tucked under his armpits. Behind him came her older brothers 11 and 13, each holding the rope with both hands. Behind them came Lydia, with the family's only Bible inside her coat, because she could not bear to leave it. Behind her came Ezra, walking last, the way he had learned in 19 years of moving cattle in bad weather, the way the strongest man always walks last when there are children on the line. They reached the Vestergaard cabin near dawn on the morning of the 3rd day of the storm. Tobin opened the door. Bram pressed forward into Soren's legs. Wyatt sat up on the rug, weak and pale, but conscious. And one by one the Brackens came inside. Emma Bracken did not open her eyes for another 12 hours, but she lived. The color came slowly back into her hands. The breathing deepened. Sometime in the afternoon of the 3rd day, while the storm still raged outside and the cabin held its small pocket of warmth, the 7-year-old girl opened her eyes and looked around at the unfamiliar room and saw the dog lying beside her, and she reached out one small hand and laid it on Bram's head. The dog did not move. The first thing Emma Bracken said when she finally spoke was, "What is the dog's name?" And Tobin Vestergaard, sitting on the floor beside her, said, "His name is Bram, He likes to be scratched behind the ears." And Emma scratched the dog behind the ears, and the dog sighed and pressed his head against her thigh, and Lydia Bracken, sitting in the rocking chair near the stove, put her hands over her face and wept silently for several minutes. Over the next 30 hours, others came to the Vestergaard cabin. Klaus Vogt arrived first, leading his wife Margareta and his twin daughters Friederike and Liesel through the storm with a length of clothesline tied around their waists, having survived the first 2 nights in his own cabin, which was insulated partially with the straw from its dairy barn pressed against the north wall, but having decided that his family would be safer in a cabin built for this. He came in, shook Soren's hand without speaking, sat down beside the stove, and stayed. Mordecai Hollis came next, walking slowly on his bad leg, carrying a sack of dried venison on one shoulder and his old buffalo hide robe on the other. He had survived in his dugout perfectly well. He had come because he had heard somehow in the unknowable way that old men in old country know things, that the Vestergaard cabin had become a shelter for the valley, and he had felt that he should be there. Annette Hartwell, the school teacher, was carried in by Klaus Vogt on the second trip he made out into the storm. She had been alone in her small room behind the schoolhouse, and her chimney had collapsed under the weight of the ice, and she had been sitting wrapped in every blanket she owned, watching her own breath freeze on the inside of her window when Klaus had broken through her door and lifted her bodily into his arms and carried her out into the wind. He brought her to the flower cabin because the flower cabin was the only place left in Sweetwater Valley where heat was holding. And Dr. Felix Reinhardt, whose office had collapsed under the weight of the snow on the second day, walked in on the morning of the fourth day, his medical bag in one hand and a frozen beard reaching halfway down his chest, and he looked around the cabin at the people gathered there and at the temperature and at the warm, dry interior walls, and he sat down heavily on the bench beside the stove and said, in his slight Bavarian accent, "It is a still air boundary layer. The sunflower stalks create a turbulent disruption zone. I should have understood. I should have understood." By the end of the fourth day, there were 11 people in Soren Vestergaard's small cabin. They slept on every available surface. They shared food from a single pot. They told stories in low voices to keep the children calm. Bram moved among them with the dignified attention of a host, and in the corner, near the stove, sitting on a stool with her hands folded in her lap, Lydia Bracken began to feel the first labor pains. She had not told anyone she was pregnant. She had been only 4 months along, and the heavy winter coats had hidden it, and she had not yet wanted to share the news because of 2 previous pregnancies that had ended in heartbreak. But the storm and the cold and the fear had brought the labor on early. Dr. Reinhardt, who was fortunately the very best doctor for 40 miles in any direction, took Annette Hartwell and Margareta Vogt aside, and they made up a small clean space in the corner with sheets and a basin of warm water from the stove, and through the long hours of the storm's 5th day, Lydia Bracken labored with her 3 older children watching wide-eyed from the rocking chair, and her husband, Ezra, holding her hand and telling her over and over that she was strong, that she was strong, that she was strong. The baby was born just after dark on the 5th day of the storm. A girl, small but breathing, crying right away with a thin, healthy wail that filled the cabin with a sound none of them had expected to hear that winter. Dr. Reinhardt placed her on her mother's chest, and Lydia Bracken wept and the children wept, and Ezra Bracken pressed his forehead against his wife's shoulder and could not speak. When Lydia could speak again, she looked across the cabin at Soren Vestergaard, who was standing in the doorway between the small partitioned bedroom and the main room, holding a kettle of hot water. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Her name is Astrid. We would like, if you do not mind, to name her Astrid." Soren Vestergaard, the silent widower, the eccentric, the man whose mother's name had been Astrid Halverson, Vestergaard, who had walked from Telemark to Marion County, Kansas, with a body of practical knowledge that she had spent her life passing down to her son, stood in the doorway of the cabin she had taught him how to build, and he did not say anything. He could not say anything. He simply nodded once and turned back to the stove, and the cabin was very quiet for a long time, except for the thin, healthy crying of the newborn child. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th day. It broke the way such storms always break, with a slow easing of the wind, a thinning of the snow, and finally a long, pure silence that fell over the buried valley like a benediction. Soren Vestergaard was the first to step out onto the porch. He stood there for a long moment, blinking in the sudden brightness, looking at a world he did not recognize. Drifts had buried fences. Cattle lay in dark mounds along the windward edges of the pastures. Trees were down. The Bracken cabin 300 yards away was a pile of snow with a partially collapsed roof. The town in the distance was barely visible, and the Vestergaard cabin stood with its dense brown wall of sunflower stalks somewhat torn at the top of the north wall, where the wind had finally chewed through the outermost layer, but otherwise intact, holding its warmth, with 11 souls alive inside it and a newborn baby sleeping on her mother's chest. Ezra Bracken came out onto the porch behind Soren. The two men stood there in the snow, not speaking. The sun was rising over the eastern ridges, and the light was unbearably bright on the new snow, and the silence was absolute. Then Ezra Bracken laid his gloved hand against the dense, frozen wall of sunflower stalks beside the door. He held it there for a long moment. Then he walked back inside and laid the same hand against the warm interior log wall, the way Astrid Halverson had laid her 12-year-old palm against the inside of the Friesen root cellar in Kansas in 1860. And he stood there for a very long time. And when he turned around, his eyes were wet, and he looked at Soren Vestergaard, who had come back inside behind him, and he said in front of his wife and his children and the doctor and the school teacher and Klaus Vogt and Mordecai Hollis and his own newborn daughter and the boy Tobin and the dog Bram, the words that he had been carrying for 2 days and could no longer carry without speaking them. "I was wrong, Soren. I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save my family. Forgive me." Soren Vestergaard looked at his neighbor. He did not gloat. He did not lecture. He did not say, "I told you so." He reached out and took Ezra's hand the way men of that generation took each other's hands when there were no other words, and he held it, and he said, "There is coffee on the stove, Ezra. Come and sit down." The valley counted 47 dead by the end of January. Children mostly, old people, a few young men caught out in the open with their cattle. 3 of the smaller homesteads along the western edge of the county had collapsed entirely. The cattle losses were beyond counting in those first weeks and would not be fully tallied until the spring melt revealed the dark, scattered shapes across the pastures. The great die-up, as the history books would come to call it, had broken the open-range cattle industry of the American West. Sweetwater County would not be the same after that winter. Some families left in the spring and never came back. Some families stayed and rebuilt. But every family in the valley, without exception, would carry the memory of that January with them for the rest of their lives. And every family in Sweetwater County, by the end of the next summer, was growing sunflowers against the walls of their cabins. Ezra Bracken was the first to plant. He came to Soren in April of 1887, hat in hand, and asked to be shown how. Soren took him out to the cabin walls, still wrapped in their gray winter coat of dried stalks, and he showed him how to clear the old material, how to till the soil close to the foundation, how to space the seeds, how thick to make the bands, how to tie the stalks in September, how to weave the heads into the gaps. Ezra listened the way a man listens when he has nearly lost his children. He took notes in a small leather book. He asked questions Soren had never been asked before. And in May, the Bracken cabin was planted on all four sides. Klaus Vogt planted at his dairy alongside the new band of stalks he laid against the barn where his twin daughters slept. Annette Hartwell planted at the small parcel of land she purchased that spring with 3 years of saved teaching wages on a south-facing slope 2 miles east of the schoolhouse, and she planted there alone with the quiet determination of a woman who had decided that she did not need anyone's permission to put down roots in a country that had laughed at her once and would not laugh again. Dr. Reinhardt, who did not have a homestead, wrote a long letter about the principal to a colleague at the medical college in St. Louis, who passed it to an engineer at the railroad, who passed it to an architect in Chicago, and within 5 years, variations of the technique would appear in design manuals for cold country construction across the upper Great Plains. Reverend Pemberton planted at the parsonage and never again preached a sermon on the dangers of pride. Wyatt Bracken, who lost the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand to the frostbite, but kept the hand planted at his own claim when he came of age, and he planted with the careful attention of a man who knew in his body what was at stake. Even Jubal Whitaker, who had run the betting pool at the trading post and lost $5 to Klaus Vogt, came to Soren in May and asked quietly, with no laugh in his voice, if he might be shown how. Soren showed them all. He never charged. He never gloated. He worked alongside each of them for a day or two until they understood the technique with their hands. And then he went home to his own cabin and his son and his dog, and he did not speak of it again unless someone else brought it up first. In 1892, a surveyor passing through Sweetwater County on his way to map the Wind River foothills noted in his field journal that he had observed a curious feature on a number of homesteads in the valley. Log cabins surrounded by dense plantings of dried sunflower stalks bound against the walls in thick mats, giving the structures the appearance of haystacks with chimneys. He wrote that the residents called the technique sunflower walls. He wrote that the practice was attributed to a man whose name he recorded as Mr. S. Vestergaard of Sweetwater. The name had changed. It was no longer the flower cabin spoken with the downward inflection of amusement. It was the sunflower wall spoken with the level tone of a method, a practice, a thing that worked. Bram lived to be 14 years old. He died in his sleep on the porch of the Vestergaard cabin in September of 1896. an old gray dog with white on his muzzle and a softness in his eyes that no one in Sweetwater had ever forgotten. Tobin, who was 19 by then and preparing to leave for Wyoming Territory's first college in Laramie, dug the grave himself in the soft September soil beneath the first row of sunflowers on the south wall. He carved a small wooden marker with his own knife. The marker read, "He saw what they could not." Soren Vestergaard never remarried. He continued to work the homestead. He continued to plant his sunflowers every spring. He continued to read his mother's journal in the long evenings. When Tobin came home from Laramie at the holidays, the two of them walked together through the sunflower beds, father and son talking quietly about whatever was on their minds. Tobin became a teacher and then a school principal in Cheyenne. And in 1926, when he was 50 years old, he wrote a small memoir about his father and the winter of 1886. He published it himself at his own expense, and he gave copies to the Historical Society and to the library, and to the surviving children of every family who had been in the cabin on the night Astrid Bracken was born. Astrid Bracken, who had married a wheat farmer named Calder Yates in 1907 and raised 4 children of her own on a homestead near Casper, kept her copy on the table beside her bed for the rest of her life. She told her grandchildren the story of the night she was born every Christmas Eve, and every Christmas Eve she ended the story the same way. There was a dog named Bram. He was the first thing I touched in this world that was not my mother, and he was warm. Soren Vestergaard died in the autumn of 1908 at the age of 60 in the cabin he had built. He died in his bed with his son beside him, with Mordecai Hollis's old buffalo robe folded across his knees, with the sound of the late September wind moving through the sunflower stalks outside the window. His last words, according to Tobin's memoir, were a sentence in Norwegian that he had learned from his mother. Veggen var klar. The wall was ready. In 1978, 92 years after the storm, a team of researchers from the University of Wyoming, working on a study of historical insulation techniques in cold climate vernacular architecture, reconstructed Soren Vestergaard's design on a test cabin, built to the same dimensions as the original. They surrounded the cabin with a 3-foot band of dried sunflower stalks bound with jute cord packed and woven exactly as Tobin Vestergaard's memoir had described. They equipped the cabin with sensors. They subjected it to a controlled winter season at the university's high-altitude research station in the Snowy Range, and they measured heat retention performance 2.7 times greater than that of an identical unwrapped cabin. They published their findings in a small academic journal that very few people read. But the engineers who designed the United States Research Facility at the South Pole, the Amundsen Scott Station rebuilt in the 1970s, used a related principle in their architecture, the principle of a still air boundary layer disrupting wind-driven convective heat loss. The modern passive house movement uses the same principle today in homes that consume 90% less heating energy than conventional construction. The Vestergaard cabin itself still stands. It is owned by the Sweetwater County Historical Society. Every September, when the sunflowers planted in front of it by volunteer school children reach their full height and turn their faces toward the autumn sun, a small ceremony is held on the grounds. A teacher reads from Tobin Vestergaard's memoir. A historian explains the principle of still air insulation, and anyone who wishes is invited to come up onto the porch, lay a bare palm against the inside of the south wall, and feel for themselves the temperature that Astrid Halverson felt under her own 12-year-old palm in Marion County, Kansas in 1860. I want to ask you one last thing before I go. I have been telling you this story for almost an hour and a half, and I have asked you to think about the things you are quietly building in your own life that the people around you do not understand. I hope you have written some of them down in the comments. I have read them as I have been speaking. There is a woman who is teaching herself to paint at 72. There is a grandmother who is trying to reconnect with a daughter she has not spoken to in 11 years. There is a widow who has decided to learn how to drive again. There is a man who is taking care of his wife through dementia and has not told his children how hard it is. There is a woman who is writing letters to a grandson in prison every single week, even though he has never written back. I see you. I see all of you. I want you to know something. Every one of those things you are building is a wall against a wind that is coming. Maybe the wind is loneliness. Maybe it is grief. Maybe it is the slow loss of a person you love to an illness that has no cure. Maybe it is just the long winter of a life that has not gone the way you hoped it would go. And the people around you, even the people who love you, may not understand what you are doing. They may even laugh the gentle, dismissive laughter of people who have not yet stood inside a blizzard and put their bare hand against a wall. But you do not need them to understand. Soren Vestergaard did not need the people of Sweetwater Valley to understand. He needed the wall to be ready. And when the wind finally came, the wall answered for him. The wall answered for his son. The wall answered for his neighbor's 7-year-old daughter who lived to scratch a dog behind the ears and grow up to be a grandmother in her own right. The wall answered for a newborn baby who took her first breath in a cabin built by a man who would not stop planting flowers even when an entire valley was laughing. So, keep planting. Keep building. Keep doing the quiet work that no one around you can see the purpose of. The wind is already moving somewhere on the other side of the mountains of your life. But the wall, if you have been faithful to the building of it, will be ready when it arrives. And on the other side of the storm, on a morning so still that you can hear the snow settle, you will stand on your own porch, and someone you love will be alive because of what you built. And that, my dear ones, is the only thing in this life worth a long summer's work. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Tell me in the comments who you are building your wall for. I read everyone, and I will see you in the next story. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or to actual events, is coincidental. The Great Die-Up Winter of 1886 to 1887 is, however, a true event in American history. The technique of still air boundary layer insulation is real and continues to be used in cold climate construction to this day.